It was 9:17 a.m. on January the 22nd, 1943, Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. The heat was suffocating, and Second Lieutenant John George was holding a weapon that technically shouldn't have been there. His commanding officer called it a toy. His platoon called it a mail-order sweetheart. It was a civilian Winchester Model 70, fitted with a delicate Lyman Alaskan scope. It was a deer-hunting rifle. It didn't have the grit of a standard-issue Garand. It didn't have the volume of a Thompson. The armorer had asked him if he planned to hunt deer or Germans. But the United States Marine Corps had a problem that standard-issue weapons couldn't solve. In the last 72 hours, 14 Marines were dead. They were being picked off by 11 elite Japanese snipers hidden in the banyan trees of the Point Cruz groves. The Japanese Arisaka Type 78s were tearing the platoon apart. The Marines were blind, they were dying, and they were terrified. They needed a miracle, or they needed a sportsman. John George wasn't just a lieutenant. He was an Illinois state champion, a man who could put 5 rounds inside a 4-inch circle at 300 yards. He had saved 2 years of National Guard pay just to buy this specific rifle. So when he stepped into the ruins of that Japanese bunker, he didn't care that the officers had laughed at his civilian scope for 6 weeks. He had 11 targets, he had a toy gun, and he had 0 confirmed kills. That was about to change. This isn't just a war story. This is the legend of the deadliest bargain in military history. The bargain was simple. 1 Illinois man's paycheck against the best snipers the Japanese Empire could field. The man was Second Lieutenant John George, 27 years old. Before Guadalcanal, before the humidity and the blood, George was a champion. He was a competitive target shooter from Alton, Illinois. His domain was precision, and he was the definition of patient focus. His title, Illinois State Champion, won on the 1,000-yard range in 1939, was earned not through brute force, but through meticulous craft. When war became inevitable, George made a decision few other military men could understand. He could not rely on the government's equipment. He would rely on his own. The standard issue for U.S. troops was the M1 Garand, a superb semi-automatic weapon. But George wanted precision above all else. He saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy the rifle that defined American craftsmanship, the Winchester Model 70. It was a civilian's rifle, often called the rifleman's rifle. He paid for the highest precision components, a classic steel receiver chambered in the powerful .3006 round, and he topped it with the most advanced optic available to the public, a Lyman Alaskan scope mounted on a specialized Griffin and Howe base. It was a beautiful, pristine tool, meant for deer, not Japanese troops hidden in the jungle canopy. The rifle cost him nearly $150 in 1941. That was the equivalent of over a month of a working man's salary. This rifle represented George's commitment, his savings, and his absolute belief that precision was the only way to survive the coming war. When the 132nd Infantry shipped out for the Pacific, bound for the most miserable piece of real estate on the planet, Guadalcanal, George had to make a final plea. Military protocol demanded he use standard issue. George convinced his superiors that his experience with the Winchester made him useless without it. He successfully argued to ship his custom weapon not through the armored holds, but through military mail. 6 weeks later, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate marked Fragile. The crate contained the deadliest piece of equipment his regiment could ever see. The mockery began the moment the crate was opened at Camp Forest in Tennessee. The armorer looked at the pristine hunting rifle and asked, "Dear Lieutenant, or Germans?" George's direct reply, "Japanese," only intensified the laughter. They called the bolt-action rifle his mail-order sweetheart. They suggested he might scratch the expensive walnut stock on the rough canvas of the transport ship. The weapon was a joke until it landed with the 132nd Infantry Regiment on Guadalcanal. They were there to relieve the battle-weary Marines who had been fighting since August. They had won Henderson Field, but they hadn't broken the Japanese grip on the island. The fighting was ugly, slow, and measured in feet, not miles. George's battalion first attacked Mount Austin. They fought for 16 days through bunkers and heavy defenses. They paid a heavy price. 34 men killed and 279 wounded. But George had yet to fire a shot in combat. His rifle was not needed for front-line assaults. Then they moved west to the coastal groves near Point Cruz. The fighting changed entirely. This wasn't about bunkers. It was about silent, invisible murder. The remaining Japanese forces had retreated into the dense, suffocating jungle, a mass of high, ancient banyan trees and thick undergrowth. It was here, concealed in the canopy, that the Japanese snipers took over the war. They were masters of the environment. Silent, invisible. They carried the scoped Arisaka Type 98, and they knew exactly how to wait for the moment of complacency. The casualties became sickening. On January the 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. 2 days later, 3 more men died, one of them shot clean through the neck from a position the patrol had already walked past twice. In 72 hours, 14 men from the 132nd were dead. The battalion was paralyzed. They were being killed faster than they could be reinforced. That night, the battalion commander, desperate, summoned George. He needed someone who could shoot. He needed proof that George's mail-order rifle could actually hit something. The question was simple, laced with desperation. "Lieutenant, can that toy of yours actually hit anything?" George didn't flinch. He rattled off his credentials like data. Illinois State Championship, 1,000 yards in 39, 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. He finished with the cold fact that mattered. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. George spent the night checking the Model 70. He cleaned off the cosmoline. He checked the scope mounts. He loaded 5 rounds of 30.06 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee. The answer to this crisis lay not in the armory, but in the hands of a civilian sportsman and his mail-order sweetheart. The story begins now. Morning came with a heavy mist. January the 22nd. George didn't march out with the platoon. He moved alone, sliding into the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. He was 240 yards away from the tree line, the groves, where the 14 men had died. He settled into the mud. He cleaned the Lyman Alaskan scope, and then he did something no other Marine had done in that sector for weeks. He waited. The Japanese snipers were ghosts. They tied themselves high into the banyan trees, massive, ancient structures with aerial roots that created natural cages. They used smokeless powder. They wore camouflage nets made of local vegetation. They didn't move for hours, sometimes days. To the naked eye, the jungle was empty. But George wasn't using the naked eye. He was using a 2.5 times magnification scope that gathered light in the shadows, and he wasn't looking for a soldier. He was looking for the mistake. At 9:17 a.m., he found it. Through the circle of his scope, 240 yards out, a patch of leaves in a banyan tree didn't look right. It was too dense, too patterned, the unnatural shape of a sniper's hide. George adjusted his body. The Winchester Model 70 was heavy, 9 pounds of steel and walnut. He rested it on the bunker ledge. He calculated the drop. 30.06 ammunition. 240 yards. Negligible wind. He centered the crosshairs on the suspicious lump of leaves. He exhaled. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the civilian rifle sounded different than the military Garand's. It was sharper. Downrange, the clump of leaves shuddered. A limp leg dropped from the foliage, swinging loosely in the air. Then a rifle fell, clattering through the branches to the jungle floor. Confirmed kill. The men in the bunker behind him stared. For 6 weeks that tree line had been a death sentence. George had just reached out and touched it. But George didn't celebrate. He cycled the bolt. He chambered a fresh round. The shot had echoed through the valley. The Japanese snipers knew where he was now. He had killed one, but there were at least 10 more out there, and they were all looking for the muzzle flash of the mail-order gun. The duel had begun. January the 23rd. The morning began with a false sense of security. The rain stopped at 8:15 a.m. By 9:12 a.m., George spotted the 6th sniper. This one was positioned at the limit of his comfort zone, 290 yards out. George compensated for the distance and dropped him. Kill number 6. But the silence that followed the shot was heavy, not empty. It was the silence of a calculated, inevitable counterattack. At 9:57 a.m., the air pressure changed. It wasn't a rifle crack. It was a dreadful, dull thump. Japanese mortars. They had triangulated his position based on the muzzle flash. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short, shaking the earth under the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, knowing the third salvo would be accurate. As he drove into a muddy shell crater, the bunker he had just occupied vanished in a cloud of dirt and shrapnel. He realized the stakes had violently escalated. He wasn't just a hunter anymore. He was a high-value target whose elimination justified the expenditure of heavy fire. He didn't retreat. He crawled 120 yards north to a fallen tree, cleaned his scope, and resumed the hunt. The Japanese were forcing him to fight on the move. The enemy sent more snipers that afternoon, placing their best men to leverage George's newly exposed position. At 14:23, George killed his 7th target, concealed deep in the foliage. At 15:41, he spotted number 8. This sniper was silhouetted 94 feet up against the thinning light. George fired one last time before dark. Kill number 8. 8 confirmed kills in 48 hours. 3 snipers remained. By day 3, the war had shrunk down to a few hundred yards of jungle. It became a game of high-stakes patience. George began to understand the enemy's psychology. The Japanese snipers were disciplined, but they had a fatal flaw: arrogance. They were so used to invisibility they forgot their tactics were predictable. At 8:17 a.m., George spotted sniper number 9. The soldier was visible in a palm tree, only 190 yards out and low, 40 feet up. It was too easy. The shot was a gift George knew he couldn't take. George realized it was a trap. The sniper in the palm tree was bait. He was placed low to draw a quick, careless shot. If George fired at him, the real sniper, number 10, would be watching from a higher, concealed position, ready to kill George the moment he revealed his muzzle flash. George lowered his rifle. He ignored the bait. He scanned the surrounding trees inch by agonizing inch. It took him 11 minutes to pierce the illusion. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the decoy. The 10th sniper was perfectly concealed, watching George's expected position. George made a cold calculation. He used the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree and fired. The decoy fell. Immediately before the echo of the first shot faded, George smoothly cycled the bolt and swung his rifle towards the real threat in the banyan. The 10th sniper instinctively turned towards the sound, revealing his head for a single critical half-second. George fired again. 2 shots, 2 kills. The tactical and psychological victory was absolute. He grabbed his gear and sprinted. Seconds later, Japanese machine gun fire raked the position he had just left. The enemy was furious. The climax came on the 4th day. Now only 1 sniper remained, the 11th ghost. George relocated to a shell crater partially filled with cold rainwater. He sat in the mud, water up to his chest, his attention focused solely on the sector. At 9:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper wasn't in the trees. He was stalking George on the ground. George spotted movement, a deliberate shift in the undergrowth. The Japanese sniper was crawling towards him, flanking his position. At 10:03, the sniper reached the safety of a cluster of rocks, 38 yards away. But he wasn't alone. Through the scope, George saw a second soldier, an infantryman, covering the sniper's advance. The odds had suddenly shifted from a duel to an ambush. George waited. He let both men move past the lip of his crater, exposing their backs. He rose from the water like a swamp monster, the Winchester dripping but ready. He fired at the first man. Bolt cycle, smooth and fast. He fired at the second man. 11 snipers dead. The sector was cleared. But the shots attracted a Japanese infantry patrol of 6 men. Suddenly, George wasn't fighting snipers. He was fighting a squad in a close-quarters firefight. He dropped back into the water. When the first soldier looked over the rim, George shot him from the water. He killed 2 more as they crested the hill, using his last remaining rounds. Out of ammo, George scrambled out of the crater and sprinted for the American lines, his life depending on the momentum of his feet. He made it back to Camp Morris with 2 rounds left in his pocket. The final tally: 11 snipers killed, 3 infantry killed, 12 rounds fired. The toy rifle had cleared the sector. The psychological stranglehold was broken. The Japanese, realizing their invisible snipers were being hunted by something they couldn't see, withdrew from the groves. But George wasn't done. The shooting was over, but the investigation was just beginning. He needed to know why the enemy had been so effective. George walked out into the clearing. The silence was broken only by the dripping of water and the buzz of insects feeding on the rot. He approached the banyan tree where he had made his first kill. He climbed the aerial roots, his hand sliding on the smooth, wet bark. He wanted to see how the ghost stayed put. He found the answer immediately. The sniper wasn't just sitting. He was strapped in. Ropes cut from parachute cord and thick vines crisscrossed the body. Even after George's 3.06 round had killed him, the corpse was held firmly against the trunk. The man was a permanent part of the foliage. This was the core of the terror. This was the waste. For weeks, Marines had been pumping M1 rounds into corpses, thinking the enemy was unkillable. They were just shooting at rope. George descended, carrying the Japanese rifle he had recovered. He handed it to his commander, a man still pale from the ordeal. "Commander, you're telling me half our ammo went into dead bodies?" George: "Sir, the man was a dummy after the first shot. We need to stop chasing ghosts and start chasing the flaw in their design." The flaw was not tactical. It was technological. George, the gunsmith, analyzed the captured enemy's rifle, the Arisaka Type 99. It was long and looked crude compared to the American Garand. But George saw the genius in its application. It featured a chrome-lined barrel, something U.S. military rifles lacked, which prevented rust and fouling in the brutal tropical humidity. It was a weapon built specifically for this climate. The Americans were fighting a jungle war with tools built for European fields. George's meticulous after-action reports were not just a tally of 11 kills. They were an intelligence blueprint. He documented the failure of U.S. optics, the effectiveness of the Japanese camouflage, and the mechanical superiority of the chrome barrel. His intelligence packet was shipped straight out of Guadalcanal to the Ordnance Department. It was the ultimate vindication of the mail-order sweetheart. George didn't just save a regiment, he helped change the American military doctrine. But while his reports went to Washington, John George did not go home. The war in the Pacific was vast, and the Army had a new suicide mission that required a man who understood the jungle. The shooting was over, but the war wasn't. George's success had sent shockwaves up the military command chain. His rifle had proved that the problem wasn't the Japanese soldier. It was the failure of American equipment and doctrine in the jungle. On January the 27th, George was promoted, and Colonel Ferry made him an offer. He didn't just want George to kill, he wanted him to teach. The Army scrambled to find equipment, locating 14 Springfield rifles, fitted with the long-range unearthed scopes left behind by the Marines. They assigned George 40 expert marksmen from the regiment. George took them to a makeshift range. He taught them patience. He taught them breathing. He taught them to trust the optic, knowing that the most valuable thing they owned was the quality of their vision. On February the 1st, George took 4 of his new teams into the field. In 6 hours of work, they killed 23 Japanese soldiers from concealed positions. 0 American casualties. By February the 9th, George's newly formed sniper section had racked up 74 confirmed kills. The man who was mocked for his toy rifle had just revolutionized infantry doctrine in the Pacific. But George's work was cut short. Near the Tarnum-Boa River, a Japanese bullet struck him in the left shoulder. He was evacuated, patched up, and told his war on Guadalcanal was finally over. It wasn't. In 1944, George volunteered for a classified mission. He was shipped to India to join the 5,307th Composite Unit. History would know them by a different name: Merrill's Marauders. Their mission was to descend into hell, a 700-mile trek behind Japanese lines in Burma to capture the Myitkyina airfield. No tanks, no trucks, just men, mules, and rifles, hacking through the most impassable jungle on Earth. George knew that the war in Burma would be different from Guadalcanal. It wasn't a static sniper's duel. It was a war of movement. Every ounce mattered. George looked at his beloved mail-order sweetheart. It was too heavy. The Lyman Alaskan scope and the Griffin and Howe mount were steel monsters. So George modified the weapon again. He removed the heavy scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330, the same scope used on the 1903A4 sniper rifles. He stripped the heavy wooden stock and replaced it with a lighter synthetic version. He shaved 14 ounces off the rifle. In a 700-mile march, 14 ounces is the difference between keeping your weapon or dropping it in the mud. The Burma campaign was brutal. The Marauders were ravaged not by bullets, but by disease. Malaria, dysentery, and typhus killed more men than the Japanese. The mules broke their legs on the steep cliffs and had to be shot. George marched with a fever. He marched with rot in his boots, but he kept the Winchester clean. In 3 months of guerrilla warfare, George only fired the Winchester 3 times. Once at 412 yards, dropping a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards, silencing a machine gun nest. Once at 290 yards, killing a sniper who had pinned down a marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. The opportunities for precision fire were rare in the claustrophobic jungle of Burma, where firefights happened at 20 yards. But when the shots offered itself, the Illinois state champion never missed. By the time the Marauders captured the airfield in May 1944, the unit had ceased to function. They were skeletal ghosts. But George walked out with his rifle. John George finally returned to the United States. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He trained new officers for Fort Benning, teaching them the lessons of the mail-order war. He put the Winchester Model 70 in a footlocker. He rarely looked at it. But his reports had done their work. By the end of the war, the Ordnance Department had scrambled to develop the M1C Sniper Garand, an infantry rifle fitted with a scope derived directly from civilian models like George's. He proved that specialized scope rifles, the kind the military had mocked him for, were not luxuries for a few. They were necessities for every front. He proved that sometimes the difference between winning and losing is not brute force, but having a better quality of vision than the enemy. The little civilian rifle had silenced the ghosts of Guadalcanal and modernized the U.S. Army's approach to sharpshooting. In the end, John George received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. He went on to live a quiet, distinguished life, dying in 2009 at the age of 90. But the rifle didn't disappear. If you go to Fairfax, Virginia today and walk through the halls of the National Firearms Museum, you will find a glass case. Inside, surrounded by pristine prototypes and gold-inlaid generals' guns, sits a beat-up, weather-worn hunting rifle. The stock is scarred from the Burmese jungle. The metal is pitted from the Guadalcanal rain. It looks like a cheap pawn shotgun. Most visitors walk right past it. They don't know that this is the mail-order sweetheart. They don't know that this piece of wood and steel cleared the Point Cruz groves when an entire battalion couldn't. It remains the silent witness to the deadliest bargain in military history. 1 man, 1 paycheck, and a rifle that beat an empire. But you didn't walk past. You stopped. You listened. And because of you, the legend of John George lives on for another day. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, if you believe that heroes like John George shouldn't disappear into the silence of an archive, then do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button. We are digging through the dust of history every single week to find the men and women who held the line when no one else could. And if you're watching this right now, Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or simply leave the name of a hero in your own family who served. Let's fill the comments section with a memorial that no one can ignore. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us keep history alive.